All right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our BCBA practice question series, where we're going through another set of questions together and breaking them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. When you pass your exam, please let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. A behavior analyst is consulting for a manufacturing site where workers must assemble devices correctly. Instead of observing each worker throughout the shift, the behavior analyst analyzes the completed devices at the end of each day to assess skill acquisition and procedural fidelity. The behavior analyst chooses this method primarily because why? Now, let's start with what method was chosen. We know the analyst is looking at workers who assemble devices, and instead of observing each worker during the shift, the analyst analyzes the completed devices. So when we analyze the product or the outcome of a behavior, what are we using? Well, we're using permanent product. Now, why would the analyst decide to use permanent product to assess skill acquisition and procedural fidelity in this situation? A, it ensures behaviors are directly observed and recorded in real time, reducing observer reactivity. Now, permanent product will typically reduce observer reactivity because we aren't observing the learner or the client in this case. However, we aren't directly observing the behaviors either or recording them in real time. So half of A is correct, but the other half is not. B, permanent product data provides immediate feedback during task completion. Again, with permanent product, we're not giving the feedback or recording the behavior during the behavior. We are recording the outcome. And that's the most important thing to remember about permanent product. C, the target behavior results in a tangible outcome that can be measured objectively. So far, C is the best answer. Now, given what we know about this question and the information, is there another reason the analyst could have chosen permanent product? Sure, but so far C is our best answer because A and B don't fit. And then D, this method eliminates the need to define behavior's topography or consequences. Well, of course not. We still need to operationally define behavior. We still need to know what the behavior is that we're looking at. But if we're going to choose permanent product, our primary focus isn't behavior in real time, rather the product. So why does the analyst choose this method? Well, one reason is to target behavior results in a tangible outcome that can be measured objectively, the product, whereas A, B, and D don't fit. During a supervised session with the behavior analyst present, a client begins engaging in higher risk aggression towards staff. The behavior technician begins to follow the behavior plan, but the client's aggression escalates beyond what is addressed in the current protocol. What is the most appropriate immediate action for a behavior analyst to take in this scenario? This is a crisis management question. And with crisis management, regardless of who the client is and what their behaviors are, you've got to have a crisis plan and a safety plan in place. Now, this is a unique situation because this session is supervised and the analyst is present. Remember, as the analyst, you ultimately are responsible for what happens to your clients, and you have to, in a situation where harm can be done, keep everyone safe. So if you're present, if you're this behavior analyst, and the client is engaged in high risk aggression, and the behavior technician has already followed the behavior plan, but now we're getting new behavior, aggression beyond what is addressed in the current protocol. What is your role in this scenario? What is the most appropriate immediate action for a behavior analyst? A, let the technician continue implementation while the analyst begins rewriting the plan. Well, if the behavior is no longer defined by the current plan, it is not a good idea to just let the technician figure it out. Since you are there, you need to act immediately and take over. So B, assume responsibility for managing the situation and implement safety protocols is a much better idea. We are now beyond the behavior plan. You are the supervisor. You're the responsible party. You need to jump in and manage the situation. Don't leave it to your technicians in this scenario. C, end the session and report the technician's failure to de-escalate the situation. Well, no, we've got to deal with this, right? And we aren't necessarily going to blame the technician given the information at our disposal, right? All we know is the client aggression has escalated beyond what we normally see. Could it be the technician's fault? Maybe, but given the information, we don't know. We have to address the situation. As the analyst, that is your responsibility. D, initiate a functional analysis to understand the new behavior's function. Before we can get into assessment and analysis, we've got to control what's in front of us. Anytime you're in a crisis situation where someone can be hurt, you, the client, someone around the client, you've got to prevent that first before moving on to other actions. So in this case, the most immediate action, assume responsibility for managing the situation and implement safety protocols. During an observation, Tim notes that a client emits 18 instances of a problem behavior during a 45-minute session. The data are being reviewed to determine response rate in relation to time on task, which varied due to transitions. What is the most appropriate way to report the behavior's data? Not a overly challenging question, but the wording is a little difficult. So we want to report the behavior's data, right? We know Tim has 18 instances of behavior, which would be what? Well, would be our frequency during a 45-minute session. So we have frequency, we have time, and we want to know a response rate. Well, response rate is what? Frequency over time. Now, the thing is, we took this data during a 45-minute session, but we want to know response rate in relation to time on task. So our rate is going to be what? It's going to be the response, which is the problem behavior, right? And then our time is going to be time on task. So if you look at a raw count of 18 responses, that is going to give us frequency of the response, but not rate, because rate is going to be frequency over time. If we look at B as a rate per opportunity, if we divide 18 by the number of sessions, well, 18 happened in one session. If we've already had multiple sessions, what is that really going to tell us? Nothing. The 18 happened in this single session. C as a rate of responses per minute, dividing 18 by the actual time the client was engaged. Yes, we would take the response rate, the response frequency, 18, and divide it by the time the client was engaged. Let's say 30 minutes, which would give us some sort of response rate. That's not correct, but it'd be something like 0.2, 0.4 instances per minute. And that's where we get our rate. And then D, as a percentage of intervals that the problem behavior occurred, we're not looking at interval recording, right? We're looking at rate recording. So this question is an example of a measurement question, a rate question, which is very straightforward. But if we're not reading very carefully, you can easily go too fast here and miss something that you should get without a lot of trouble. We're always attacking the question first, understanding what we're looking at, and then getting into the answer choices and reading as slow as it takes to answer the question correctly. A behavior analyst conducts a free operant preference assessment by allowing a client to access a room containing various items for 10 minutes. The analyst records the total duration the client interacts with each item. The data show that the client spends 6 minutes with a musical toy, 3 minutes with a puzzle, and 1 minute with a stuffed animal. However, when the musical toy is later used as a reinforcer during skill acquisition, it fails to increase the target behavior. What is the most appropriate interpretation of this outcome? Now, you might have seen the question and thought a little panic because how long the question is. We've got to get over that. We're not judging anything by length of question or length of answer choices. We're just taking the same approach each time. Attack, attack, attack. So how are we going to interpret this outcome? We did a free operant assessment for 10 minutes. The client spent the most time with the musical toy, the puzzle, then the animal. However, when they used the musical toy as a reinforcer, it did nothing. Why? Well, it did not increase the target behavior. It wasn't reinforcing. How would you interpret this outcome? A, the client has low motivation for musical toys, and these toys should be removed from future assessments. Well, you're painting very broadly there if you're just going to eliminate all musical toys forever. The client clearly showed interest in the toy, but given the scenario, it wasn't reinforcing. So in this particular scenario, yes, but we're not just going to remove musical toys altogether. They might be useful in the future. B, the item had high preference but may not function as a reinforcer for that task or context. Yes, right? We clearly had a client who was spending time with the toy, so it looks to be a high preference toy, but it's not reinforcing because it's not increasing the target behavior. So B makes a lot of sense. C, the free operant method was flawed because the client was only allowed certain items. Well, look, with free operant, we want to allow access to as many things as possible. That's kind of the idea, but it's not going to be possible to allow access to everything. So it doesn't make it flawed because we can only get various items in one room instead of just every item ever, right? So C is not necessarily correct. D, duration of interaction, always predicts reinforcer effectiveness, so the data must have been wrong. Well, of course, that's not true. Just because we interact with something doesn't mean it's going to function as a reinforcer later. How we should interpret this is the item had high preference, but may not function as a reinforcer for that task or context. This is a good use of parsimony, the simplest explanation. You were asked to measure how long it takes for your client to complete a motor imitation task during 3 different trials in a session. You record the following durations: 8 seconds for trial 1, 12 seconds for trial 2, 10 seconds for trial 3. Your supervisor asks you to calculate the client's average time to complete the task across the 3 trials to track improvement over time. What is the client's average duration per trial? Okay, so very simple question, right? Reused a behavior technician question essentially because it's just an average duration per trial. There's a supervisor involved, right? Straightforward. So why are we using this? It's a reminder that you need to know how to calculate things like average duration, total time. What people do is neglect the simple stuff, right? Well, I already know how to do all this. I know how to do continuous measurement. I don't need to worry about it. In a testing environment, if you haven't spent any time on it and 6 months passes and you're in a stressful environment, something like average, calculating an average, might escape you. So we've got to refresh our stuff ourselves on things that may seem rudimentary. Okay. So if we want to find average, how are we going to do that? Well, you're going to add up all your data points: 8 plus 12 plus 10. That's going to give us 30. And then you're going to divide by total number of data points, which is 3. That's going to give us 10 minutes. The client average duration, 10 seconds. Client's average duration is 10 seconds. Now, why do we use this very simple question? Again, a reminder: 1, you need to know averages, and 2, don't neglect the easy stuff. Thanks for watching. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. See you soon.